In this podcast, you're going to find out about the causes, the events, and the effects of the Prague Spring. In many ways, the Prague Spring, what happens in Czechoslovakia in 1968, shares a lot of similarities with that of Hungary 12 years previously. Czechoslovakia is a Soviet satellite state. It lies on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain. Czechoslovakia was a member of the Warsaw Pact. And in the years leading up to the Prague Spring in 1968, living standards in Czechoslovakia were not great, and the leadership of the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia had imposed quite strict repression and censorship, which made their leader, a man called Antonin Novotny, extremely unpopular. In January 1968, Novotny was replaced as party leader of the country by a man called Alexander Dubček, D-U-B-C-E-K. And Dubček is seen as a popular choice, not just within Czechoslovakia, but also in the Soviet Union. Dubček was a close friend of the new Soviet leader, a man called Leonid Brezhnev, and therefore he is given a brief when taken over as control as party secretary of the Communist Party to modernise Czechoslovakia and maintain stability. But Dubček is a new generation of politician. He is, considerably, he's much younger than the politicians of the 1940s and 50s. And what he wants to do is bring a form of communism to Czechoslovakia, which is different to the Soviet-style communism, socialism that had existed in the years previous. He talked often about this notion of socialism with a friendly face. And in many ways that is kind of symptomatic of where Czechoslovakia lies. Czechoslovakia had been a democracy before the Second World War, and what Dubček wanted to do in the 1960s was to, within the framework of socialism, widen the democratic processes as much as possible, while still lying within the Comecon sphere within the Warsaw Pact. And so what does he do? Well, from April 1968, he introduces a series of reforms, and he relaxes press censorship. He allows opposition groups to be formed. The government tolerates public criticism. More power is given to the regional offices within Czechoslovakia, because Czechoslovakia is quite a diverse country, it's quite ethnically diverse. More power is given to the Czech Parliament, and actually what is quite forward-thinking is that within the socialist system he introduces a form of market socialism, where capitalism, small businesses are allowed to flourish within Czechoslovakia. And so when you're giving examples of how perhaps this censorship relaxation works, you could talk of playwrights such as a man called Václav Havel, Vaclevhavel, and they wrote scripts, plays, books that were openly critical of the government. Something that perhaps we take for granted in the West, but this was unheard of within the capitalist system, in the communist system in the 1960s. Older communists within Czechoslovakia were absolutely horrified with what he was doing. What is this young politician trying to do to this country? But of course, the biggest alarm bells began ringing in the Soviet Union, back in Moscow. Brezhnev could not understand what his best friend was doing in Czechoslovakia. And although, unlike what Náš did in Hungary, where Náš just completely broke from the Soviet Union, Dubček never had any intention of leaving the Warsaw Pact. He didn't want to leave the Eastern Communist Bloc. But I think Brezhnev felt that Dubček was being rather naive. Dubček felt that his brand of socialism was the future. Brezhnev, ever the realist, saw the implications of what these kind of reforms that became known as the Prague Spring, because it often it took place in April, springtime, but also it gives this feeling that that new things were afoot. There's a new change in the world, and that this Prague Spring could spread, and if it spread to other Eastern European countries, it would loosen the Soviet Union's control over the satellite states, which ultimately would threaten the security of the USSR. Now, again, you just need to go back to the mindset of what most Russians are thinking about. Even 20 years after the Second World War, they will not tolerate any form of potential instability in those countries close to the Soviet Union, i.e. the Eastern Bloc, the Warsaw Pact countries. And he was in contact with Dubček regularly throughout the early summer, midsummer of 1968. What are you doing, my friend? Can you please not understand the impact that's going to have on the wider countries and on the security of the Soviet Union? So by August 1968, Brezhnev was coming around to the idea that some form of military intervention would be required in Czechoslovakia to stop the Prague Spring, to stop the thaw that these reforms that were having such an impact. And this philosophy, this need to invade, this decision to invade, came out of what became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. Now, what the Brezhnev Doctrine means essentially is, just like the Truman Doctrine before, is that to ensure the security of the Soviet Union had the right to invade any country that it saw posed a potential threat to the security of the Soviet Union. So essentially that meant it could invade whoever they wanted to, and it had a right to do so, because there was a fundamental principle at stake here, i.e. the security of their nation. And so tanks roll in to Czechoslovakia in 1968. What the textbook for GCC doesn't say, that actually what made it different to the Hungary invasion, was that it was the invasion took place under the umbrella of a Warsaw Pact invasion. So we actually see East German military involved, we see Polish military involved, and that again is a method from Brezhnev to show that this is a solidarity movement. It's kind of the Eastern Bloc together going in to sort out this one rogue state, Czechoslovakia. Unlike Nagy, Dubček orders the population of Czechoslovakia not to protest against the invasion, and therefore we don't see the kind of repression that the tanks in Budapest did in 1956. We see peaceful protests. If anything, the people on the streets of Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia, put up banners. They kind of stand in front of the tanks, but they don't throw Molotov cocktails or fire bombs at the tank or try to kill the soldiers off. So the violence that we see in Prague in 1968 is by no means incomparable to the 20,000 killed in Hungary in 1956. Dubček is hauled back to Moscow, where apparently a tearful Brezhnev gives him a good dressing down, saying, "What have you done? Look what you have created. What mess we have in front of us." He was forced to sign what's called the Moscow Protocol, Dubček was, which essentially meant that Czechoslovakia had to toe the line, go back to the way it was, and reimpose censorship and strict Soviet-style control of the Soviet Union, of Czechoslovakia. And that's what we see. Political opposition is banned, and Czechoslovakia goes back to the Dark Ages. Goes back to the old style of government. Now, America, just like in Hungary, has an option. What do? Do they intervene because the Soviets have just invaded a supposedly independent country, or do they do nothing? And America at this time is fighting a very, very messy war in Vietnam that is unpopular back home, and arguably it would be hypocritical of America to get itself involved in the country, because Russia didn't get involved in Vietnam directly, and therefore all that the American president does, a man called Lyndon Johnson, is to criticise the invasion. The reaction in Western Europe is a bit different. Similarly, they criticise what the Soviet Union has done, but what it also does is that actually in the mid to late 60s, communist parties in countries like France and Italy were growing in popularity, and they were siding themselves all the while with Dubček's form of socialism with a human face. And actually the Soviet invasion distances these Western communist parties from Moscow, and actually they split altogether. And their brand of communism, and you can talk about perhaps the notion of Euro-communism, grows in popularity. Even countries, though, that were traditionally loyal to the Soviet Union became openly critical, and two in particular. Good old Yugoslavia, ever the one to criticise Soviet encroachment in Eastern Europe, criticises, but so does Romania. And Romania is openly hostile to why the Soviet Union needed to invade. And what we see is Yugoslavia and Romania sign alliances with the Republic of China, the People's Republic of China, in the late 1960s. So in many ways, Czechoslovakia and the invasion was damaging to Brezhnev, but at the same time, it stopped the spread of this potential challenge to the security of the Soviet Union. So there we have it. The causes, the events, and the effects of the Prague Spring.